Lila had never been more excited to move into a new place. The apartment building was older, with its worn bricks and ivy climbing the exterior walls, but it had character. Nestled in a quiet corner of the city, the neighborhood seemed peaceful enough. After months of living in cramped, noisy spaces, she felt like she'd finally found somewhere she could settle, somewhere that felt homey. The inside was modest but cozy, with wooden floors that creaked slightly when you walked and tall windows that let in the late afternoon light. She unpacked her boxes, humming softly as she moved around the small space. Every new item she placed, her favorite books, a framed photograph of her family, a worn but comfortable chair, made the apartment feel more like her own. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the room grew quiet, something interrupted her thoughts. A sound, faint and distant. It was like the soft, high-pitched whimpering of a child. Lila paused, her hands frozen over a box, listening intently. The sound came again, but it was so faint that she brushed it off as an odd creak of the building settling. Old buildings like this were bound to have strange noises. Shrugging it off, she resumed unpacking, convinced that whatever she had heard was nothing more than the charm of living in an old place. That night, however, as Lila lay in bed, the apartment wrapped in stillness, the sound returned. This time, it was unmistakable, a faint, distant cry, like a child calling out from somewhere deep within the walls. Lila sat up, her heart beating a little faster. She strained to listen, trying to locate where the sound was coming from. She threw the covers aside and padded softly through the apartment, following the noise. Standing by the walls, she pressed her ear against them, but the crying was gone. Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a neighbor's child. Or perhaps it was just the old pipes making strange noises. But the more she thought about it, the more unsettling the situation felt. She wanted to shake off the feeling, and yet the nagging thought of the crying wouldn't leave her. Lila returned to bed, convincing herself it was nothing, but her mind was still restless, the echoes of the crying lingering in her thoughts. 2 days later, as Lila was having dinner, the crying returned, and this time it was louder, more insistent. She froze, her fork hovering just above her plate as she listened. The sound was sharper now, like the cry of a child lost and desperate. Her unease grew. It didn't sound like something from the neighboring apartment. It sounded closer, as though the walls themselves were crying. Unable to ignore it anymore, Lila decided to ask her neighbors about it the next morning. But when she brought it up casually to the older woman who lived next door, the woman's face immediately became tight and uncomfortable. "Oh, it's just the building settling," she said hastily, her eyes darting away. "These old places are always making noises." Another neighbor gave her a similar response, brushing off Lila's concerns with a dismissive smile. Yet something about their responses felt forced, as if they were avoiding a subject they didn't want to touch. Lila walked away feeling more unsettled than ever, the sense that something was wrong deepening. That night, the crying became almost unbearable. It echoed through the walls, louder and more desperate, as though the child were trapped and couldn't escape. Lila tossed and turned, the sound burrowing into her mind, refusing to be ignored. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, determined to find out what was going on. As she moved through the apartment, the sound seemed to grow clearer, leading her to one specific section of the wall near her bedroom. She pressed her ear against it and could hear the faint sobbing as though it was coming from just behind the plaster. The wall felt different here, hollow, as if something was behind it. Without thinking, Lila grabbed a small hammer from her toolbox and began chipping away at the plaster. Her movements were frantic, driven by the need to uncover whatever was hiding behind that wall. The plaster crumbled, revealing bricks beneath. Lila's hands shook as she pulled at the loose bricks, one by one, until an opening formed. Dust filled the air, making her cough, but she continued until she revealed a small, bricked-up doorway. Her heart pounded as she stood back, staring at the dark, hollow space she had uncovered. Behind the bricks was a small, windowless room. The crying had stopped now, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt far worse. She shined her flashlight inside, her pulse racing as the beam illuminated the walls. Faded, childish drawings covered the walls, simple stick figures and scrawled names, barely legible now after years of neglect. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The room felt cold, impossibly cold, as if the air had been sucked out of it. And then she felt it, a cold, gentle touch on her shoulder. Lila spun around, shining the light behind her, but no one was there. Her skin crawled, every instinct telling her to run, but she couldn't move. For a long moment, she stood frozen, listening, but the crying had ceased, leaving only the deep, unsettling silence. She stumbled back out of the hidden room, her legs trembling as she hurried to cover the doorway with an old blanket. She couldn't bear to look at it any longer. The next day, Lila couldn't shake the unease that gripped her. The image of the strange room, the faded drawings, and the cold touch haunted her thoughts. Determined to find answers, she went to the local library to research the building's history. She spent hours combing through old records and archives until she stumbled upon a series of newspaper articles from decades ago. The headlines made her blood run cold. Children disappear from local apartments, no traces found. Last seen in apartment 3B, the mystery deepens. Lila's heart pounded as she read the details of the missing children, all of whom had lived in the building she now called home. The last known address for several of them was her apartment. The police had investigated, but no bodies were ever found. The stories all ended with the same chilling line: the children were never seen again. A horrifying realization dawned on her. The crying wasn't just an eerie sound, it was the children. The spirits of the missing, trapped within the walls of her apartment, their desperate voices calling out for someone to hear them. That night, Lila could barely sleep, her mind racing with fear. She had wanted answers, but now that she had them, she wished she had never asked. The crying returned, louder than before, filling the apartment with its mournful wails. It seemed closer now, not just behind the walls, but inside her apartment. Terrified, Lila stumbled into the bathroom, desperate to escape the sound. She splashed water on her face, trying to calm herself, but when she looked up into the mirror, she froze. Her reflection was fading. Slowly, her own face blurred, replaced by the shadowy image of a child. The figure's wide, empty eyes stared back at her through the glass, its mouth forming the silent echo of her own scream. Lila stumbled back from the mirror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But as she backed away, her scream blended into the crying, as though her voice was becoming part of the same eerie wail she had heard for nights. She realized, in that terrible moment, that she was no longer alone. Her voice, her presence, was merging with the others, the lost children, trapped in the walls, forever echoing through the apartment. The crying would never stop. And now, she was part of it. Daniel cradled the newborn in his arms, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. The baby's tiny fingers curled against his chest, soft breaths barely audible in the quiet room. Mia was resting on the bed behind him, her eyes half closed in exhaustion. Daniel whispered softly to the child, his voice filled with awe. "You're going to have such a good life. We'll take care of you, I promise." He turned to place the baby in the crib, careful not to disturb its peaceful slumber. As he stepped back, he noticed Mia watching from the bed. Her expression wasn't what he expected, there was no trace of the joy or relief he felt. Instead, her face was blank, her eyes distant, as though she was staring right through the baby, right through him. "You okay?" Daniel asked gently, walking over to sit beside her. Mia blinked, her gaze shifting slightly, but she didn't meet his eyes. "I'm just tired," she mumbled, her voice flat, devoid of any real emotion. She turned her head toward the darkened corner of the room, her body stiff. Daniel frowned, following her gaze, but there was nothing unusual there, just shadows creeping in from the hallway. "You sure?" Daniel asked again, his concern deepening. Mia gave a faint nod, still not looking at him, before lying back down. Daniel stared at her for a moment longer, feeling an odd discomfort settle in his chest. He didn't press her further. She had just gone through childbirth, exhaustion was to be expected. Still, as he left the room, something about the way Mia stared into the shadows unsettled him. Over the next few days, Daniel noticed Mia's behavior becoming more strange. She refused to let anyone else hold the baby, even him. She would spend hours in the rocking chair, cradling the child, staring out the window with an intensity that made Daniel uneasy. Her conversations grew shorter, more distant, and she seemed utterly fixated on the baby. "Mia, you need rest," Daniel urged one evening. "Let me take the baby for a while." But she shook her head sharply, her arms tightening around the child. "No. I need to watch him," she said, her eyes never leaving the infant. "I can't let anything happen." "What's going to happen?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his tone light. "We're safe here." Mia didn't respond at first, but after a long pause, she whispered, "Something's watching him. I see it in the shadows." Daniel's blood ran cold, though he forced a reassuring smile. "Mia, you're just tired. You've been through a lot. It's normal to feel anxious, but there's nothing in the shadows." She didn't respond, her gaze still fixated on the baby, her face expressionless. As much as Daniel wanted to brush it off as postpartum stress, a growing sense of unease lingered in the back of his mind. That night, Daniel awoke to the sound of soft whispers. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim light of the room. He turned toward the crib, and there was Mia, standing over the baby, her back to him. She was whispering something in a low voice, so quiet he could barely make out the words. "Mia," he called out softly. She didn't respond. Daniel sat up slowly, straining to hear what she was saying. One word caught his attention: replacement. His heart skipped a beat. "Mia," he repeated, louder this time, swinging his legs out of bed. "What are you doing?" Mia jumped at his voice, stepping away from the crib so quickly she almost stumbled. "Nothing," she said, her voice trembling. Without another word, she hurried past him, leaving the room. Confused and uneasy, Daniel walked over to the crib. The baby lay there, perfectly still, its wide eyes staring up at him, unblinking. The sight sent a chill down his spine. The baby wasn't crying, wasn't making a sound. It was just staring. The next few days brought more troubling signs. Daniel began to notice strange bruises on the baby's skin, small marks that hadn't been there before. Mia brushed them off, insisting the baby was fine, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The child's eyes seemed different too. Darker, more distant. There were moments when Daniel would look into the crib and feel as if the baby was watching him, its gaze too knowing for a newborn. One evening, after another tense exchange about the baby's condition, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. "Mia, what's going on?" he demanded, his voice filled with frustration. "You're not acting like yourself. The baby's not acting right either. What aren't you telling me?" Mia's face contorted with a mix of fear and guilt. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. "It's not him," she whispered. "The baby, it's not ours." "What are you talking about?" Daniel asked, feeling a knot of dread twist in his stomach. "Something took him," Mia sobbed, her voice shaking. "The night he was born. That thing in the crib isn't our child." Daniel stared at her, disbelief flooding his mind. "That's impossible. You're not making sense." Mia grabbed his arm, her eyes wild with desperation. "I know how it sounds, but you have to believe me. It's not our baby. I don't know what it is, but it's not him." Daniel backed away, unable to process what she was saying. He looked at the crib, the baby lying so still inside, and a deep, instinctual fear began to creep over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. That night, while Mia slept, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't stay in the house with whatever that was in the crib. Quietly, he gathered the baby, wrapping it in a blanket. The child barely moved, its silence unnerving. Daniel slipped out of the house, driving to his mother's place, desperate for help, for someone to make sense of what was happening. When he arrived, his mother opened the door, her eyes sleepy but concerned. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with worry as she saw the frantic look on Daniel's face. "I don't know," he said, breathless. "Something's wrong with the baby. Mia's acting strange. I need you to look at him." His mother took the baby from his arms, pulling back the blanket. As she did, her face turned pale, her eyes widening in horror. This isn't a baby," she whispered, stepping back, nearly dropping the child. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean? "What are you talking about?" He looked down at the baby for the first time in days, really looked at it. His breath caught in his throat. The baby's skin was cracking, peeling away in thin strips, revealing dark, leathery flesh underneath. Its eyes, once so innocent, were now black and lifeless, too wide for its small face. Daniel stumbled backward, his entire body trembling. The baby, no, the creature, looked up at him, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. Then, it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. "Daddy," it whispered, the voice far too deep, too sinister for something so small. Daniel's mind raced, a wave of nausea and terror crashing over him. This thing in his arms was no longer a baby. It was something else entirely. And it was looking at him with pure, unfiltered malice. The creature's grip tightened on his arm, its fingers digging into his skin as its body continued to shift and change, growing more monstrous with every passing second. Daniel's scream caught in his throat, his legs refusing to move as he watched the creature transform before his eyes. In a final, desperate act, Daniel dropped the creature to the floor, stumbling back until he hit the wall. His breath came in shallow gasps as he watched the thing rise slowly, still grinning, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" It crawled toward him, its eyes gleaming with dark intent, its voice echoing in the small room. Daniel's body refused to move, frozen in terror as the creature closed the distance between them. As the creature's shadow loomed over him, Daniel's world went black. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, sipping her morning coffee, enjoying the soft quiet of the early hours. The sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Everything seemed peaceful, just as it should be. This was the tranquility she had craved when she moved into the small suburban house a few months ago. She finished her coffee, stood up, and began gathering her things for work when something caught her eye. One of the kitchen chairs, the one closest to the window, was slightly out of place. Sarah frowned. She distinctly remembered pushing all the chairs in last night before going to bed, a habit she never skipped. "Must have bumped it," she muttered to herself, brushing off the unease that tugged at her mind. It was such a small thing, not worth worrying over. With a quick glance around, she left the house and headed to work, pushing the oddity from her mind. That night, Sarah returned home exhausted. She dropped her keys on the counter and headed upstairs to change into something comfortable. The day had been long, and all she wanted was to relax before bed. But as she passed through the kitchen, something gave her pause. A glass sat on the counter, one she hadn't taken out. She had been meticulous that morning, making sure everything was put away. Sarah picked it up, her fingers brushing the cool surface as a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. She must have left it out and just forgotten. After all, she had been distracted. With a slight shake of her head, she put the glass away, trying to suppress the unease growing in her chest. As she settled into bed, the house creaked softly, its usual settling noises. But this time, the sounds felt different. She heard faint creaking, almost like footsteps. The noise was too soft to fully grab her attention, so she drifted off to sleep, the unsettling feeling lingering at the edges of her dreams. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Sarah returned home from work one evening to find the chairs in the kitchen completely pulled out from the table, as though someone had just finished a meal. Her heart raced, confusion giving way to creeping fear. No one else had been in her house, and yet there the chairs were, deliberately moved. In her bedroom, the bed covers were slightly ruffled, as though someone had been lying there. Her pulse quickened as she inspected the room, but there was no one, nothing to explain the disturbances. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah decided to set up cameras around her home. Maybe it was some prank she couldn't figure out, or maybe she was sleepwalking. Either way, the cameras would reveal the truth. She installed them in the kitchen and bedroom, carefully positioning them to capture every angle. That night, as she reviewed the footage, her stomach dropped. The cameras had recorded nothing, not a single movement, only the aftermath. The kitchen chairs were still pulled out, the bed covers still disturbed, but there was no sign of anything or anyone moving them. Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through the video, the eerie absence of explanation chilling her to the bone. It didn't make sense. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Determined to stay up and catch whatever was happening, Sarah sat on the couch late one night, wide awake. The minutes ticked by, slow and excruciating, as she kept her eyes fixed on the dark corners of the room. Every little creak or groan of the house set her nerves on edge. Around midnight, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Sarah pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. The chill cut deep, unnatural for the mild night. That's when she heard it, faint footsteps coming from upstairs. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, Sarah stood, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached for the flashlight on the coffee table. The footsteps were soft, deliberate, as though someone or something was moving carefully, trying not to be heard. But it was too late for that. She had heard it. With trembling hands, Sarah crept up the stairs, each step agonizingly slow, the wood creaking beneath her feet. The hallway stretched before her, dark and silent, but her bedroom door was ajar. The footsteps had stopped, but the dread clawed at her insides, urging her to turn around, to leave the house. But she couldn't, not yet. She pushed the door open wider and shined her flashlight into the room. The bed was perfectly still, the room empty. Relief washed over her for a moment, but then she noticed it. The bed, the one she had made just hours before, was sinking slightly in the middle, as though someone or something was lying there. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the indentation shift, like the invisible form was moving under the covers. Her legs felt weak, but she couldn't move, frozen in place as the air around her thickened with an ominous presence. Backing out of the room slowly, Sarah's hands shook as she tried to process what she had just seen. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps as she hurried downstairs, her mind racing. She needed answers, she needed to know what was happening in her home. She grabbed her phone and pulled up the live feed from the cameras. But as she watched the screen, she saw nothing, just the empty kitchen, the motionless living room. There was no sign of the entity that had been moving through her home. The footsteps, the shifting bed, none of it appeared on the cameras. That's when it hit her. Whatever had been moving things in her house, disturbing her bed, was invisible. It had been there all along, living in the shadows, unnoticed until now. Sarah felt her stomach twist in fear as she realized how long she had been sharing her home with an unseen presence. She had been blind to it, but now it was making itself known. Her hands tightened around her phone as a fresh wave of panic surged through her. She had to get out. She had to leave, now. As Sarah rushed toward the front door, her hand barely touched the doorknob before it slammed shut with a deafening bang. She gasped, stumbling back, her heart hammering in her chest. The room grew colder, the air heavy with something malevolent. Then she felt it, a cold, firm grip around her throat. Sarah choked, her hands flying to her neck, trying to pry away the invisible force that was tightening its hold. She couldn't breathe. Her legs kicked helplessly as the pressure around her throat grew more intense, lifting her off the ground. A voice, low and chilling, whispered in her ear, "I've been waiting for you to notice." Terror surged through her, her body thrashing as she struggled to free herself, but the grip only tightened. She gasped for air, her vision darkening, her strength fading as the unseen force dragged her backward, pulling her into the shadows. The last thing Sarah felt was the overwhelming cold, the suffocating darkness closing in on her as her body went limp. Later, the camera she had set up in the living room recorded the final moments. The footage showed only Sarah, alone, her face contorted in agony, her hands clawing at her throat as she was lifted off the ground. There was no visible attacker, just Sarah, seemingly choking on air, her body jerking and twitching as it was dragged out of frame. The camera glitched, the image flickering and fading to static. The final shot captured only the stillness of the empty room, except for one detail, a lifeless hand, pale and motionless, lying in the corner, just out of focus. Then the feed cut out entirely, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in the darkened house. Sarah was gone, claimed by the unseen guest that had been waiting patiently for its moment to strike. The sun was setting when Mark's car sputtered to a halt on the deserted country road. The engine gave one final cough before dying completely, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere. Mark sighed, his frustration mounting as he tried the ignition again and again, but nothing happened. His phone had no signal, of course it hadn't for miles. He stepped out of the car, slamming the door shut as he surveyed his surroundings. There were no houses, no buildings in sight, just fields stretching out on either side of the road. His eyes scanned the horizon until he spotted something, an old, faded sign barely visible in the dimming light. Motel, it read, with an arrow pointing down a narrow dirt road. Mark squinted, trying to make out the rest of the lettering, but it was too worn to read. Still, it was his only option. Grabbing his backpack, he started walking, the road stretching out long and empty ahead of him as the sky darkened. The motel came into view as the last bit of daylight faded, and it wasn't exactly welcoming. The building was run down, its once bright paint now peeling and cracked. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the entrance. Mark hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The lobby was dimly lit, and the air felt thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something else Mark couldn't quite place. Behind the reception desk sat an old man, his wrinkled face illuminated by the flickering light of a single lamp. He smiled as Mark approached, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for a room?" the old man asked, his voice raspy, yet unnervingly eager. Mark hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, just for the night. My car broke down on the road." The old man's grin widened. Of course. We don't get many visitors these days. You'll find it nice and quiet here." He handed Mark an old-fashioned key with a tag that read Room 3. "Enjoy your stay, for as long as it lasts." Mark paused at the strange phrasing, his hand lingering on the key. He gave the old man a tight smile and headed toward his room, chalking the comment up to the man being eccentric. The hallway was dark, the carpet worn thin, and the lights flickered as he passed under them. Mark unlocked the door to his room, stepping inside and immediately locking it behind him. The room was sparse, just a bed, a dresser, and a small TV in the corner. He collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, his eyes growing heavy. The weariness of the day caught up to him quickly, and within minutes, he was asleep. When Mark woke up, something felt wrong. The room was still dark, much darker than it should have been for morning. He glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It read 8:59 a.m., but no light streamed through the window. Confused, Mark reached for his phone. The display confirmed it, 9 a.m. Yet outside, it was as if the sun had never risen. He threw on his jacket and hurried outside, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the empty motel corridor. When he stepped into the parking lot, the eerie twilight greeted him. The sky wasn't pitch black, but a murky, bluish-gray, like the hours just before dawn or after sunset. The world felt stagnant, like it had paused just before the night could fully break or the day could properly begin. Mark scanned the lot. His car was still broken down by the road, but there was no sign of life. The silence was palpable, no birds, no wind, not even the hum of distant cars. It was as if the entire world had gone still. He shivered, glancing back at the motel. He made his way to the lobby, his unease growing. The reception desk was empty this time, the old man nowhere to be found. "Hello," Mark called, but his voice sounded small in the heavy air. He stepped behind the desk, knocking on a door that seemed to lead to the back office, but there was no answer. The place felt even more lifeless than before. Something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, but there was no one in sight. The other guest, he remembered seeing a single car in the lot when he'd arrived. Maybe they knew what was going on. Mark made his way down the hall to room 4, knocking on the door. "Hello? Anyone in there?" There was no response. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Heart pounding, Mark turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was empty, completely untouched. The bed hadn't been slept in, and there were no signs that anyone had been staying there at all. Panic clawed at his chest. He was alone. Mark raced back outside, his mind racing. He ran to his car, desperate to escape this nightmare. After a few futile attempts, he managed to jumpstart the engine, and relief flooded through him. But as he drove down the road, that relief quickly turned to horror. The road twisted and turned, but no matter which direction he went, the motel reappeared in front of him. Again and again, he circled back, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as his heart pounded in his chest. No matter how far he drove, he ended up in the same place, back at the decrepit motel, trapped in a maddening loop. "Come on," he shouted, slamming his fists against the dashboard. His breathing grew shallow as the realization sank in, he couldn't leave. Frantically, Mark pulled out his phone, hoping to call someone, anyone. But there was no signal, not even a single bar. Worse, his battery, which had been fully charged, was draining at an impossible rate. He watched in disbelief as the percentage dropped before his eyes, 50%, 40%, 30%, until the screen went black. With nowhere else to turn, Mark ran into the fields surrounding the motel, his legs pushing him further and further away. But the landscape was the same in every direction, flat, desolate, and suffocatingly still. His voice echoed back at him as he screamed for help, but there was no response, no sign of life anywhere. No matter how far he ran, the motel was always there in the distance, looming like a specter that refused to release its hold. Exhausted and terrified, Mark returned to the motel, his legs aching and his mind racing. He staggered into the lobby, determined to find the old man and demand answers. To his surprise, the old man was sitting behind the desk, just as he had been the night before, a calm, eerie smile on his face. "Leaving so soon?" the man asked, his voice dripping with amusement. "What's going on?" Mark demanded, his voice cracking with fear. "Why can't I leave?" The old man's smile widened, and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with something unsettling. "You're not meant to leave," he said. "This place, it keeps those who check in. The day never ends, you see. You'll relive it, over and over." Mark stared at him, his blood turning to ice. "That's insane. I'm getting out of here." The old man chuckled softly, standing up from his chair and slowly walking toward the door. "Look in the mirror, Mark." Mark turned, his gaze drifting to the large mirror behind the reception desk. His heart nearly stopped. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. Instead, it was him dressed in the same worn-out uniform as the old man, sitting behind the desk, the same eerie smile on his face. "No," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, this can't be happening." The old man opened the door and stepped outside into the misty twilight, disappearing into the haze without another word, leaving Mark alone in the empty motel. Mark turned back to the mirror, his hands trembling as the realization set in. He was the next caretaker. The motel had claimed him, just as it had claimed the old man before him. Now, he was bound to it, trapped in the eternal twilight, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to check in. Mark sat behind the desk, staring at the vacant lobby, his heart heavy with dread. The world outside was silent, frozen in time, and he knew that he would never leave. It was just past 11 p.m. when Amy noticed the car for the first time. She had been sitting by her window, absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone, when something caught her eye. An old, black car sat idling across the street, its headlights off, blending almost too perfectly into the shadows of the quiet suburban night. Amy squinted, trying to see if she recognized the vehicle, but the windows were too dark, too tinted to see through. She dismissed it at first, thinking it could be someone waiting for a friend or a neighbor. The minutes ticked by, and the car remained. Amy's curiosity grew, but it wasn't enough to pull her away from the warmth of her living room. She glanced at the clock again, 11:45 p.m. The car still hadn't moved. It was strange, but maybe the driver had fallen asleep or was waiting for someone running late. Eventually, the engine hummed softly as the car pulled away without a sound, disappearing into the night. The next evening, Amy forgot about the car entirely. Her day had been busy, and by the time she settled into her usual spot by the window, it was nearly 11 p.m. again. She reached for a cup of tea when her eyes caught the same black car pulling up across the street. A chill ran through her, though she couldn't explain why. It was just a car. Maybe a neighbor had a new visitor, someone staying late. But as she stared at the vehicle, Amy couldn't shake the strange feeling creeping up her spine. The car sat there, its engine quietly rumbling, its dark windows impenetrable. Amy watched it, unease growing by the minute. After exactly 1 hour, as if on cue, the car drove off again, leaving her staring into the empty street, heart pounding in her chest. By the third night, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Each night, at exactly 11 p.m., the car would pull up, idling for an hour before leaving just as silently. The regularity of it unnerved her. Why would someone park in the same spot, at the same time, every night? Amy couldn't see any movement inside the car, couldn't make out a silhouette. It was as though the vehicle was watching her, waiting. That thought lodged itself deep in her mind, refusing to let go. Who would do this, and why? The street was quiet, too quiet, as if the whole neighborhood had turned its back on her, leaving her alone with the car's silent threat. By the fifth night, Amy decided she couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was going on. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, she waited by the door, heart racing as the clock approached 11. When the familiar low hum of the car's engine reached her ears, she stepped outside, cautiously approaching it from the side. The street was empty, the air thick with tension. As she neared the car, Amy's heart pounded so loudly in her chest she thought it might burst. The engine rumbled quietly, but there was no movement inside. She raised her flashlight, angling it to peer through the dark windows, but just as she reached for the door handle, the engine roared to life. The car sped off, tires squealing as it disappeared down the street, leaving her standing alone in the dark. Amy stumbled back toward her house, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had been so close. Shaken and frustrated, she bolted the door behind her, pacing the living room, trying to make sense of it all. Something was terribly wrong, she knew it now. A week later, Amy was ready. This time, she wasn't going to let the car get away. She sat in the darkened corner of her porch, hidden by the shadows, her body tense as she waited. The car arrived like clockwork, the faint hum of its engine sending a shiver down her spine. She crept toward it, each step careful and measured. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Amy's heart pounded in her ears as she reached the car. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed the door handle, this time managing to pull it open before the car could escape. But when she looked inside, her breath caught in her throat. There was no driver. Instead, the seat was empty, except for a stack of old photographs sitting on the passenger seat. Amy's hand shook as she picked them up, her pulse quickening with each picture she flipped through. Her own face stared back at her, captured in grainy black and white. The photographs spanned her entire life, images from her childhood, her teenage years, and even some from the past few weeks. The most recent ones were the worst, taken through her windows, showing her sitting in her own living room, moments when she had thought she was completely alone. With a gasp, she dropped the photographs, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She stumbled back from the car, her mind racing with terror. Who had been watching her? And how long had they been doing it? Amy slammed the door shut and fled back to her house, locking herself inside. Her heart raced as she double-checked every window and door, the silence of the night pressing in on her from all sides. She couldn't stop thinking about the pictures, about the car, about the strange, terrifying regularity of it all. The next night, Amy sat by her window, unable to relax, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. The clock ticked toward 11 p.m., and she knew the car would return. But this time, it didn't park across the street. It stopped at the end of her driveway, its engine purring softly as it idled there, much closer than before. Her heart leapt into her throat. She crouched behind the curtains, peeking out just enough to see the car through the glass. The darkened windows stared back at her, impenetrable and menacing. And then, the doorbell rang. Amy froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she stood, walking toward the front door. Her hand hovered over the knob, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She yanked the door open, but no one was there. Instead, a pile of photographs lay scattered across her porch. They were the same ones she had seen in the car the night before, along with a new one, an image of her standing at the front door, taken only moments ago. On top of the pile was a note, scrawled in neat, precise handwriting, "Get in." Amy's mind raced. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she paced the living room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The car was still there, sitting in her driveway, waiting for her. Then, she heard it, a soft, metallic click from outside. The car door had swung open on its own. Amy's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it now, the cold air pressing against her skin, the weight of something unseen watching her. A shiver ran down her spine, her body frozen in place. And then, she felt it, a cold, invisible hand gripping her shoulder. A whisper, so close to her ear she could feel the breath on her skin. Get in. Amy's mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything but obey. But her body moved of its own accord, her legs carrying her toward the open car door. She stepped outside, the night air unnaturally still around her. Her hand reached for the door, her fingers grazing the cold metal. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at her house. The door was still open, the lights inside casting a warm glow across the porch. She could run. She could shut the door and never look back. But something pulled her forward, an invisible force she couldn't resist. She slid into the backseat, her heart pounding in her chest as the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The car's engine purred softly, and it began to move, rolling silently down the street. The headlights flickered on, and the darkness outside swallowed them whole. The next morning, Amy was gone. Her house was empty, the front door still open. On the porch, the photographs lay scattered, but there was no sign of her. No sign of the car. Amy had vanished without a trace, becoming the next victim of the last ride.